Oh, okay. I'm Jie-Hyun. I'm extremely pleased to chair this panel, which is really related with the theme of the transnational memory. Memory is really on the move and traveling and migrating. So I'm really pleased to chair this very interesting panel on the transnational memory on move. And these speakers and their themes are really exciting, at least to me. And our first speaker is
Younes.
Younes Saramifar. He's one of the very few experts on Hezbollah. So he wrote his dissertation on Hezbollah, and he's still working on Hezbollah as a resistance movement in Lebanon and so on. So, and then next speaker is Brady Albrand, and also his topic is very specific, white South African immigrants to Australia and then their community and how did they carry their memories about South Africa and how did this sort of memory actually influence their being accommodated to the Australia and so on. So, and our discussant is Marcin Wróbel. As he came from Krakow, and also he has worked on the law and sociology, right?
Yeah.
And now he's working on the third orientation of cultural studies. So even his, how can I say, academic interest itself is very much transdisciplinary. So he's the right person to discuss all those transnational memories on the move. So. And then the procedure of this panel is like that. The speaker will have 20 minutes for their presentation, and Marcin Wróbel, as a discussant, will have about 10 minutes for discussion. Then we want to open the discussion to the floor. So in a way of Q&A, they may complement their presentations on different topics, right? Okay. Younes.
So, let me start like this. I am a combat zone anthropologist. Basically, it means my work area is mostly in combat zones and conflict areas and looking at how the militants and how people are able to kill. But the fact is that I have been a child of war myself, and my family basically is displaced because of the war between Iran and Iraq. So the war has been a close friend in my life. And interestingly, when as an ethnographer finished my work with Hezbollah in my PhD work, I understood how memory matters in my work, because as an ethnographer, you go to the combat zone, you go to conflict areas, you come out and you try to work out your memory, what you remember, because during the adrenaline rush and excitement of the working in the combat zone, you don't have much time to take notes. So you basically come back with your assistant or you alone to remember what happened. And interestingly, when I understood how the memory is important in doing ethnographic work, then I started looking at the entire of the propaganda system designed in Iran because of keeping the memories of the war between Iran and Iraq alive. So the memory works in the various layers for me. It works for me as a scholar, it works for me as a person who has lived with the memories of Iran and Iraq, and meanwhile, as somebody who is trying to make his life in academic. So that I give you this brief description to tell you, if there is something called entangled memories, is somehow we as a scholar, we as a theoricians, we are entangled in our own subject, in our own ways of writing theories. And in this entanglement, sometimes the way we choose to write about memory of others, it influences, or basically somehow we have to revisit influence. So that's the first idea of why I choose certain style of theory and the style of working on memory. And the second is difficulties that I'm addressing audience, which I think they have very little notions of Middle East and Islam in particular. So I give you descriptions of the field and the kind of Islam which I work with, and if there is time left, then I justify my theoretical orientation. So, as many people would know, maybe Islam has two major sects. One is Sunnis and one is Shia. The Sunni, the people who follow the traditions of Prophet directly connected to him, and the Shias who follow the son-in-law of Prophet Ali, who basically is supposed to be direct interpreters of the text. So the text is not taken as a literal meaning, but as interpreted by a certain saint. And the saints are continued in 12 preceding numbers, and the 12th one is an occultation, and he has gone to the skies the way the Catholics believe about Jesus. So, and they shall come back apparently together and spread justice. So that kind of makes Shia's community a messianic community, which has different notions of time, different notions of future, past, and present. So in the larger level, Shias are a minority of the Muslims in the entire world. And the dominated populations are in Iran, Iraq, and slowly Lebanon and other places in the world. Iran-Iraq war has opened a situation. In that situation, basically, a particular regime who announced its religion as Shia religion uses the stories of martyrdom, the stories of Shiism to propagate its own agenda. But there is a particular paradigm, and that paradigm basically how it makes me to work with the idea of master narrative differently. Usually, a master narrative emerges out of the event, emerges out of the memories which are remembered. But in these cases, actually, master narrative is before the event. So what is that master narrative? That master narrative is known as the Battle of Karbala, a 6th century battle which a grandson of the Muhammad Prophet and a son of Ali, basically, he was killed in Karbala in 6th century with the tyrant of his time, and while he was deprived of water for 3-4 days, he and his family. So he stands for all the things which we understand as a martyr. He's the martyr. So every other remembrance of the Iran-Iraq war is associated to that. Every fallen soldier who is called martyr is not called martyr in his own right, actually is called martyr because of Hussein. So every martyr who is remembered as a disciple of Hussein, is remembered because of that 6th century battle. So the master narrative actually determines every other narrative of every other war fought by Shias, be it in Iran, be it in Lebanon. So this way, the master narrative bleeds into in the memories. It doesn't stay just a particular canonical narrative. It's somehow, I don't like the term distributing, but it somehow influences every other narratives. So it's interesting, if you look at all the propaganda and all the narratives which comes around this Battle of Karbala, you see that actually the people, Hussein, he himself was very vigilant of the fact how he is going to be remembered. He created a very fluid site of memory, and that's water. So the guy who was deprived of water for 3-4 days, he left one particular advice to entire of his Shias. Remember me whenever you are going to drink water. Remember, just mention my name, and you will see the Shia believers, every time they drink a glass of cold water in the summer, they say, Ya Hussein, which means, Oh Hussein, or which I remember you. So everywhere you go to India in the Shia neighborhoods, you go to Lebanon, you go to New Delhi, you go to Lahore, you go to Orange County, which has a Shia neighborhood, you see these tanks of water with the name of Hussein, or sometimes without the name of Hussein, but it's a very fixed signifier for everybody. They drink a glass and they drink it in the memory of Hussein. So this is the very literally and metaphorically fluid site of memory. And that's only because one guy in 6th century said, remember me that way. And that, it shows actually how the memory is played or memory is used by the Shias. So the Persian-speaking Shias, they use a term for memory called khatare. And the Arabs, they use memory zakkar. Both these terms, when you break the etymology of it, when you beat it down to its root, it's not about something you preserve. Memory is not something you remember. Memory is something which passes through you, and by passes it through you, the way Asman says it, basically traces of memory. It leaves some traces in you, some residues in you, and you work on that. and then the appropriation starts. So the Iranian regime basically has cornered this market of martyrdom. I call it industry of suffering. There is pilgrimage, there is festivals, there is commemoration, there is huge assembly line of the producing memory. So in Iran, basically there is one ministry called Ministry of Islamic Guidances and Culture. If you write a book, it's not like you go to a publisher and publish it. No, the publisher sends it to that ministry and there is censorship. The censorship board is an exact copy of the Orwellian system. They read it, they like it, they censor it. They don't like it, they mold the language. They mold it in a way that actually people can connect to it. The people can connect to it according to regulation and code of conduct dictated by religion and a regime. So basically you have certain forms of memory given to you, consumed by people, and in certain ways, and meanwhile, you cannot understand those memories unless you understand the master narrative. You read every line, and you immediately, basically, signifier of the very fact of the memory slips behind a signifier which Hussein stands for. And then maybe Hussein stands for certain signification, but then I have another debate on that. So one of the things which I noticed is on the when I started following and interacting with the foreign tourists, Shia foreign tourists, who come to Iran for a pilgrimage, and one part of their tour package is a pilgrimage to the previous war zones. So in the month of March, they open the borderlands, and the previous operation areas are accessible for people to go and see it. These are where all soldiers or martyrs fell. So as a part of the package, they go to the war museums and the martyr museum, which is called in Iran, and visit. It was interesting for me. So I saw a Pakistani woman who stood in front of the glass vitrine and saw a local martyr. I come from a town which is not the capital of Iran, but it's known as a tourist zone. So it's not a big town, it's a small place in geography of Iran. What happened? She broke down. And it was interesting for me. I asked her, so do you know him? And interesting, she knew him. I didn't know the guy because I am from the place. But the lady, she knew more than me. She knew even date of birth of the guy. So it was interesting for me that actually how much propaganda has actually echoed so far away to Pakistan that this lady has information about this particular person. Then I started following the lady further, and she was walking in front of each vitrine, each glass, touched him like a shrine, reciting the salutation for the Prophet, so a ritual act, and then slowly crying further. So I asked her, do you know the rest of them too? She said, these are the martyrs. So these are the children of light, these are the children of Hussein, so therefore I basically cry. So there is immediate autopilot reaction against that signifier. It doesn't necessarily need to signify. It doesn't necessarily need, because there is such an incessant and constant commemoration. There's a constant remembering. There's a forceful remembering. They have to remember. Because if you don't remember, in this case, it's not a matter of citizenship or nationalism. If you don't remember enough, you're not a good enough Muslim. So basically, you're somehow been held accountable in front of God because you don't remember a certain battle. And then, naturally, people start forming their own form of resistance and agency, and that's called, I call it autopilot reaction. You stand, it's called martyr, it's framed as a martyr, and then you start crying. So who you are exactly crying, you didn't know, because slowly, all the semiotic qualities of the words and signifiers start rubbing off and becomes so fixed that just it has immediate emotional reaction. So it slightly sounds arrogant, I understand that, because I'm basically reading the people, but I take that liberty by being a Shia scholar, by coming from that place, and by understanding these people, living with them, and also ethnography somehow gives me that privilege. So then to come to the question exactly how do I define idea of region of memory, since it seems to be the kind of question in the fact. I use the term echoes of memory. So the master narrative, let's say, to be the original of the echo. So when the echo happens and slowly travels, as far as the echo travels, that becomes a region of that particular memory. But the reason I use the metaphor of echo is the fact that echo is still losing its intensity. So when you hear the end of it, maybe basically the intensity will be lesser from the origin of it. And naturally, the working of the memory will be different, and even somehow it will be a new memory in comparison with the very started, because semiotic qualities, linguistic qualities start changing. So, however, meanwhile, the way the sound system works, basically, there is a relay on the way to amplify the echo. Sometimes there is a politics of memory which amplifies the echo on the way, and it doesn't allow it to fade. That's how echo may reach Orange County, and it doesn't fade necessarily. So that's how I define the regional memory. But also, the this industry of suffering has become a competition. So there is a major competition between both Saudi Arabia and Iranian regime. They need basically to manipulate these memories, but meanwhile, when they manipulate it, they have to keep one guy for themselves, the other guy for themselves. I give you an example of the Ahmad Shah Massoud. Ahmad Shah Massoud was known as a lion of the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan. So he is not a Shia guy necessarily. He is not truly Sunni. He was not exactly practicing Muslim, and he belongs to, let's say, to the Islamic frontiers. It's interesting how much propaganda is done by whom to keep this guy to our friend. How much posters are published, and actually when you look at the poster, it's not him and his line, it's him and a certain leader. As much as this picture is repeated and circulated further, the economic picture defines who this guy belongs to. When I work in Lebanon, so there are very young, some people would say child soldiers, who actually became a martyr during Iraq war. And Hezbollah also has its own child soldier. To give you a very recent example was Mustafa Moghniye, the son of the Imad Moghniye, one of the strategic thinkers of Hezbollah. So Mustafa Moghniye, he was a guy of around 16 to 18. He was killed in combat. But this young teenage guy, nobody talks about his story to Lebanese children who were studying in Hezbollah schools. But they are told the story of Hossein Fahmideh, who was a young, let's say in the current modern term, suicide bomber who basically tied a grenade on himself and he went under the tank. That story has been told and retold. Despite there is a 30 years gap. But nobody tells the story of Mustafa Moghniye. Because the Iranian martyrs are standing as a meaning of the martyrdom for everybody else outside Iran. And inside Iran is Hossein. So it's interesting, they basically, if you go to Lebanon, Syria, or if you go to Afghanistan, Iranian martyrs become the mediators of the martyrdom of Hossein, not necessarily actually Hossein himself. So the signifier basically finds another medium between the people, between localized martyrs. So, how much time? Okay, so I very briefly, I try to end with the method, but I'm not sure it's going to do justice to it. So, I am, as I said, anthropologist who is a delusion, flirts with a speculative realism and object-oriented ontology. Meanwhile, I sometimes actually cheat on Deleuze by going to Lacan. So I don't have the kind of allegiances which most memory studies they have. One of the particular questions I do by using a speculative realism, I don't use ontology as a trajectory. I don't use it necessarily as an idea of the history of an idea. I ask, what is the rest of what it is? If ontology asks about what it is, I ask, what is the rest of what it is? And by that, I believe you have to take put the memory on its own head and ask what is a memory in itself, rather than the fact that, okay, what memory does, or what is the epistemology of memory, which makes me to deviate from Asmans and Rigney in consequence, and also the people who produce in that center called Center for Narrative Research in University of East London, which they have a particular monopoly in this business of memories. So, I think I'm done.
3 minutes.
Okay, great. So, but what I mean by looking at the memory in itself, I followed the 19th century philosopher Charles Peirce. So he does semiotics. So he has an idea, basically, when the emergence of sign is dependent to icon, index, and symbol. To contextualize it, Hussein is an icon which resembles martyrdom. Basically, he stands for martyrdom. But then historicity of Hussein, not history of Hussein, historicity of Hussein, the history is made for Hussein, basically embodies through index. And then, in other words, basically, then when it comes to the symbol, the current martyrs, the martyrs of Iran, Iraq war, the martyrs of Lebanon, they start basically become the symbol of Hussein because they make Hussein tangible and give him sensory features. So that's how a sign emerges in my way. And when you start looking at memory in form of a narrativity, you're able to break it down, put them looking at in itself, and look at the narrative constructions of it, and look at how the sign emerges. And that's why it becomes memory minus the people. But when I say minus people, it doesn't mean completely in my work or any research work. It has to be minus people. It has to be basically a reconciliation between epistemology and ontology. And that's basically considering ontic mode of memory and memory in itself, rather than just looking at all the governance of memory, all the vectors of power influences memory, so-called epistemology, and ontology, which basically becomes history of memory, or life of memory, or traveling memory. There is an in-between, and that's called ontic modes of memory. And that's the beginning of looking at memory in itself.
Okay. Thank you very much, Younes. Very fascinating talk. It gave me a sort of deja vu because, Yasukuni is a symbol of the cult of dead soldiers. Actually, when I was hearing what you said, it reminds me of different memory scapes in the East Asia, in Seoul and Korea. So it's very interesting. And also George Moss's classical book of Fallen Soldiers, right? So this sort of, how can I say, remembering martyrs, remembering dead soldiers as martyrs is a quite prevalent the memory scape that can be found some other places. So our next speaker is problem.
Oh, God.
Don't worry, we'll just go without it.
Okay, you start and I'll continue with trying this.
Okay. That's good solution.
So I'll try to bear in mind as well if I do speak too fast, because I am Australian and we do tend to speak a lot faster than everyone else. So just give me a wave if I am speaking too fast for you. So this paper discusses the artificial memories that white South African migrants in regional Queensland take on as part of their identity after the migration to Australia from South Africa. The premise of this paper is that due to the similarities of both previously colonial nations, the similarities offer a way for white South African migrants to more easily negotiate their lives in Australia. It follows on from earlier works of scholars such as Deborah Bird-Rose and Alison Landsberg, who discuss the ongoing legacies of colonization and prosthetic memories respectively. Prosthetic memory, as I will elaborate shortly, is an artificial memory that an individual can take on and experience as their own. To open this discussion further, this paper will discuss how the legacies of colonialism in both South Africa and Australia are a part of this identity creation. I suggest that the legacy is never forgotten, rather recast in a way that maintains meaning within an Australian context and in collaboration with prosthetic memories to help to create a meaningful identity and a sense of belonging. The primary material for this analysis has been taken from my PhD project, which uses oral history interviews from 6 locations in regional Queensland. Now, all of these locations are representative of the towns in their areas, classified by their regionality. Now, by regionality, I refer to how these locations can be categorized as being more or less regional by their geographical location. Now, regional locations differ from the metropolitan areas in Australia, and in particular Queensland, because Queensland tends to maintain the legacies of the White Australia policy. The main themes that have emerged from my PhD project so far have been around memory and how participants use them to find belonging in Queensland, as well as the continuation of the legacies of racialisation and white privilege for South Africans and the similarities that they find with white Australians. This paper focuses on one particular interview where a couple discuss their opinions of Anzac Day, which is a national Australian holiday, and it serves to illustrate the process of prosthetic memory and the specific ways in which shared colonial and racialised legacies create an opportunity for prosthesis for South African migrants in Australia. Australia is a previously colonial nation that is still part of the British Commonwealth. Legacies of the colonial era are still entrenched within contemporary Australian society. Deborah Bird Rose discusses how white Australians assume the position of colonisers and their position as colonisers. Now, during the 20th century, this colonial legacy was characterised by the White Australia policy. In many ways, the acts that shored up this policy, such as the Commonwealth Immigration Restriction Act of 1901 and the Commonwealth Migration Act of 1958, were ways in which to protect and preserve white interests and to prevent the ascendancy of non-white arrivals in Australia while bolstering narratives of white belonging. Oh, cool, it's working now. I might just catch up with all the slides quickly. Yeah, sure.
So I'm ready now.
I can give you my paper. So this is the legislation during this time was dynamic, and it changed according to Australia's needs. Wasn't working. He lied to me. And it changed according to Australia's needs. But this also meant a lot of changes into what constituted being white. But this was reflected through Australia's needs at the time. Now, this for Queensland was particularly important because it was a site for other legislation around the removals of Australian South Sea Islanders who worked on Queensland's cane fields. This legacy of racialisation and colonisation still resonates in contemporary regional Queensland, where most of the population are second, third and fourth generation migrants. The immigration to Australia enabled by the virtue of their being white enough to gain entry according to the policy at the time. Now, South Africa shares a similar history of racialisation to Australia, where the legacy of colonialism still resonates today. In drawing the global colour line, White Man's Countries and the Question of Racial Equality, Marilyn Lake and Henry Reynolds discuss how Australia, South Africa and the United States of America shared similar policies of racial engineering throughout the early 20th century. Although still colonised by the British Commonwealth, South Africa has never had a white majority. The assertion of white dominance was associated with apartheid instead, the segregation of black and coloured South Africans to specific areas. Deborah Postle comments that South Africa's apartheid classified South Africans on a highly subjective basis, which violated a person's subjective sense of his or herself. Racialisation within South Africa was premised upon white privilege, born of the legacies of white colonisation on the Cape. This privilege was fearfully guarded, and in Afrikaans has been termed zwart kwaad, or black fear. For some white South Africans, this fear was realised through the end of apartheid and the process of restoring equality to all South Africans in South Africa, as well as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This prompted the imagination of a place that enabled the fantasy of return to a place that maintains white privilege, which returns them to their childhoods under apartheid. Now, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and this did take a very long time to find because this site is impossible to navigate, Queensland is the second most populous state for South Africans to migrate to. Now, contrary to the statistical trends featured in the Australian census, most South African migrants who have migrated to Queensland live in regional areas, unlike other states and territories in Australia. So here we have Queensland. Now the sites that I've used, which are now partly covered up by this, there we go. We have Toowoomba here, which is one of the locations, as well as Gladstone, which was around here, just about 45 minutes south of Rockhampton, as well as Gundawindi, which would be around here, St. George, Stanthorpe, and my hometown of Mundubbera, which is around here. Now, most South Africans who choose to migrate are well-educated professionals and managers who are white and English-speaking. This may in part be due to the recent job shortages in regional Queensland that have drawn white South Africans in due to their work in the same or similar industries in South Africa. Although at the time, it stands as a viable alternative to life in South Africa because of the similarities of both countries' pasts. The more regional migrants moved, the more likely it was that their work was within primary industries, often working on farms or as tradespeople who supported the town's primary industries, like mechanics, although in some very rare cases, some of these migrants may have also been doctors. Now, many of these participants remembered living in small towns in South Africa and reflected on how similar their present lives are to their past. One participant in particular mentioned that it's all about background. Some of those farmers, you could just pick him up and put him down in South Africa, hey, and just change his language, have the same nature, same way of walking, talking, you know, stuff that's important to them. Because farming people are the salt of the earth. Like in my own experience too, you always get people who are not nice, everywhere, in general. Now, Christian's comment draws on his memories of his prior life in South Africa and how life was then, and he draws together the similarities of both the past and his present life in Australia. Now, in part, the similarities that migrants have commented on are due to the legacies of colonisation and racialisation that are in part the experience of both Australia and South Africa. But the similarities that some migrants feel are part of what Alison Landsberg has called prosthetic memory. Landsberg describes prosthetic memories as artificial memories that are taken on and physically experienced, and this often means forgetting one's past to enable the prosthetic memory to be taken on. In other words, the prosthetic memory is attached where the lost or forgotten memory has been removed, just like an artificial limb replaces that which has been amputated. Landsberg argues that these memories are obtained through technologies of mass media, so through things like cinema and experiential museums. Also, that prosthetic memories are available to persons of all races and ethnicities and are commodified for the use by the individual. The argument of artificial memories being taken on by individuals is a persuasive argument, but I take a more liberal definition of prosthetic memory that follows more in the vein of Susanna Radstone's use of the idea. She discusses a prosthetic memory as a cultural technology that enables experience when it can no longer be experienced. Unlike Landsberg's discussion of technologies of mass media, which suggests that the only real way a prosthetic memory can be taken on is through modern technologies such as, again, cinemas and museums, as well as a somewhat what I would call idealistic assumption that people's use of prosthetic memory will be taken on as it was intended. Now, although I agree with the usefulness of the concept, some points around the transmission of memory and the way that she discusses the ownership of memory need to be reframed in order to be more useful for my project. To begin with, technologies of mass media can be taken on in ways that do not depend on such modern institutions, again falling more in the vein of Radstone's cultural technologies of memory. Secondly, prosthetic memories, I think, can actually have ownership. Although Landsberg comments that in prosthetically appropriating memories, of a cultural or collective past may make any particular histories or pasts available for consumption across existing stratifications of race, class, and gender. But I'll be discussing these points in greater detail throughout the rest of this paper. So, one example to begin with, to begin this discussion in earnest, is of one husband and wife, Richard and Renee. They originally moved from South Africa to Rockhampton, but they only stayed in Rockhampton for about 18 months. When Richard originally found a job in Rockhampton, he got to Australia to find out that the job was nothing like he was told it was going to be. His employer bullied him and made him feel very insignificant. So after a short while, he began to look for another job. Now, he ended up finding one in Toowoomba. So, in a very drawn-out process of having to fly down on weekends and do all of those sorts of things because he wasn't allowed days off so that he could attend job interviews, they eventually moved down to Toowoomba, where he started his new job and was very happy with it. And he and his family started to rebuild their lives in Australia. Now, I interviewed this couple around this time last year in their home over a few glasses of red from Stellenbosch. This couple felt the need to actively take on Australian identities and culture, or at least adapting to a more Australian way of performing similar customs, such as barbecues. One of their most pertinent comments was about Anzac Day. Now, for Australians, this represents a day of respect to Australian soldiers who have served the nation and remember those who lost their lives in doing so. I would contend that Anzac Day is part of the cultural memory of Australia, part of the founding myth of Australia as a young nation. On Anzac Day, Richard commented that Australians are so proud. Australia Day, hell man, I even get a proud lump in my throat about Anzac Day, and it's not even my culture really, but you embrace that, and people can't understand that if they're not from here. Like I told my friends that from home about it here. How could you go for something that wasn't like that, something like that, or be so proud of that? Because we're not born here, but yet Australia doesn't make you feel unwelcome. Here, Richard expresses the physical effect of exposure to and experience of Anzac Day. The lump in his throat from swelling pride in a nation that he was not born to, but implies that he is from. Renee also commented after the interview that she had a similar feeling of connection when she had to take their eldest child to an Anzac service for school. She told of taking her daughter, who was a school captain, to an Anzac Day service so that she could lay a wreath on behalf of her school. Renee commented that during the service she could not help but swell with pride at being Australian and taking part in the commemoration of Anzac Day. Towards the end of the service, she said that she could not stop herself from crying. But someone nearby who knew her looked at her and said, "I understand. You'll do." And Renee said that the acceptance of an Australian at a commemoration service made her feel genuinely Australian. In taking on Australian values and traditions, I suggest that Richard and Renee are taking on a prosthetic memory, the cultural memories of Anzac Day, and of physically experiencing their effects. Participants, particularly Richard and Renee, have chosen to take on these memories and experience them as part of their desire to become Australian and to leave behind their pasts in South Africa. Through Richard and Renee's desire to become Australian, they took on the prosthetic memory of Anzac Day through their desire to experience and gain an understanding of what Anzac Day means. They experienced a sense of connection to the white majority of Australia through the empathy they experienced towards Australian soldiers. Although Richard and Renee may have been performing a specific identity in part, Their pride in their ability to connect with Australia and what they felt was important for Australians was clearly evident during the interview. This suggests that the forgetting of the previously important parts of their identity as white South Africans is part of their becoming Australian. Now, to understand this, it is important to unpack the complex intersections of race and national identity that are tied up within the Anzac mythology. In Australia's narrative of Anzac, white Australian soldiers are privileged and remembered by Australians. Although it is important to remember that the original history of this myth actually also included Aboriginal Australians and New Zealanders, although it's fair to try to forget the New Zealanders, I guess. If we adopt a Bourdieuian framework and discuss fields of power, we can see that the dominant group within Australia, just in this instance, are the white majority. Anglo-Australians and other Australians who can be considered as being white. And this is all because of their status within Australia's immigration history, as a colonial nation that is built almost completely upon the immigration of Europeans to Australia. So this group are the dominants within the field, and they constitute the norms of this field. And the power for this group to do so is justified through their past and the remembrance of those who have gone before them, which again, in this case, infers white Australian men who died protecting their country. So what they're doing is they're summoning up the past and they're embedding the Anzac narrative within the present for the future, as if to preserve Australia's cultural memory. But at the same time, the very act of embedding this within Australia's cultural framework privileges white Australians. So, with that said, the cultural memory of Anzac is under the custodianship of white Australians, and it can't be excised from their identity because it is such a crucial part of it. But for white South Africans to take on this prosthetic memory, as memory that they themselves have never experienced, requires the deployment of their similar cultural capital in order to contextualize this history with their capacity to understand the sort of colonial nuances of both Australia and South Africa, which are quite similar. Now, although there are not actually any similar observations as Anzac Day in South Africa, their shared colonial past offers them a toolkit to provide understanding and empathy for the event. However, I would suggest that they do not take on these memories as if their own predecessors had fought in Australia, or fought for Australia rather, but that previous generations had made this possible for them to reside in Australia and to make Australia their new home. By taking this on, white South Africans are able to render themselves as being more Australian because of their shared pasts and their ability to use their colonial past as an in within an Australian context. To link this discussion back to the colonial legacies that I was discussing at the start, we can see that the legacies of the colonial past still resonate within the present of regional Queensland, and the connections between migrants taking on prosthetic memories of Anzac Day and the colonial past are important. Connections between both prosthetic memories and colonial legacies are what make white South Africans an interesting case study. As I commented earlier, Queensland is a unique site for Australian race relations. Today, Queensland remains the place of cultural threat for white Australians. But the threat that is experienced is the threat of those who are not considered, that are considered to be a threat from a distance, temporarily situated in other parts of Australia. This means that there are still similarities with South Africa, except after migration. After migration, white South Africans are part of a majority, but a majority under a threat, rather than a minority under threat. So as I've discussed, it is clear that white South African migrants can and do take on prosthetic memories. And this can assist in creating a sense of belonging in Australia. This is born from the shared colonial histories of South Africa and Australia, which offers a foundation for the similar cultures that have developed within each nation. In the contemporary era, white South African migrants who have settled in regional Queensland take on prosthetic memories to assist in creating a sense of belonging. Landsberg's prosthetic memory can be used to form the basis of analysis. Although the concept of a prosthetic memory was maintained, I elaborate on two specific departures: technologies of memory and the ownership of memories. Thank you.
Thank you, Brady. And I will toss the mic to Marcin Wróbel, who is discussant director. You have 10 minutes.
Yeah. I will try to be concise to fit into time. We've heard two very interesting presentations. There's a lot of things that we could comment on. So I will just try to mention those which I find most important and most inspiring. At first sight, I thought that it will be extremely difficult to find common issues in those two papers, and I wonder how the panelists will describe what region of memory is. We have two countries which are most important in their research. Australia, which is strictly separated geographically, so it's not that easy to decide what region is it part of, and Iran, which is to some extent maybe not separated but surrounded by former British colonies, Arab countries, and a sphere of influence of Russian Empire, white at the past, then red, then I don't know, maybe a pink one at the moment. But the authors managed to describe, to decide on quite interesting definitions of the regions of memory. Yesterday, in a couple of times, there was mentioned in this room that region of memory has not much to do with the geography. Now, in those cases, it has almost nothing to do with geography. I very like the idea of echo of memory, so how far the echo of certain notions travels. There are the boundaries of the region of memory. You mentioned that the signal gets weaker. I would ask you, as far as I remember how echo works, it repeats only some part of you shout out loud in the mountains, for example, and actually amplifies this small part of what is said. So maybe in your case, maybe in other cases, but for this theoretical proposal of echo of memory, maybe you should take into consideration that it can actually amplify only some parts of the signal and even radicalize this communication. When it comes to Australia and the links with South Africa and the British Commonwealth, it reminds me of two authors. The first one is maybe not that scientific, Doris Lessing, the famous novelist, and well, she describes the everyday life of former British colonies, which kind of remembers what was quoted during your presentation. So we have those memories shared in a group of countries which are focused not on martyrdom or not on certain important historical events, but more on everyday life. I find it very interesting because in memory studies, a lot of scholars tend to focus on crucial historical events or being victim of history and those issues that are constituting the memory of certain group, while we tend to forget about the importance of everyday life. The second author I would like to mention as yesterday we referred to the old classic Halbwachs. The one that I would like to remind comes from quite the same time. It's Norbert Elias and his concept of civilization understood in connection with the patterns of everyday life, meaning really ordinary actions that are taken by people every day. Maybe this region of memory could be called British civilization or post-British civilization. The name of that I would left to you, but I find those mentioning this everyday life especially interesting. You also mentioned the cultural capital that is needed to enter this memory. This connects to what was said about Iran. So who actually own the memory, who can be led into that, who can be a part of it. Maybe not only cultural capital, but also other capitals, especially social one, would be important. This idea of owning memory, it comes back at many situations, is strictly connected with politics of history. You can see it in many countries that certain political historical figures of important people are to some extent taken by certain political groups and used for the present needs of for some political reasons. That would be also an interesting thing to explore for both of you. I think what certain individuals need to be accepted as a part of a group which is sharing a memory. Maybe it's a cultural capital in case of Australia. What that would be in Iran, maybe a religion is the thing that is important, but you mentioned that not necessarily. So how you get into this group sharing the same memory. You asked in Younes, yes? Is it? Am I speaking pronouncing correctly? Yes. You mentioned that the most important question you ask is what memory is, not necessarily how it is used and how it can be used. Maybe you should consider rephrasing it, what memory can be. So in many situations, it can, even within one memory region, it can place different roles. That would be extremely difficult to answer the question what memory is. I think that we can find out it only by doing a certain research on how it is used, how is it phrased, and as even you mentioned in your paper, certain examples of using that. One more issue that connects with this echo of memory and understanding origin memory in that way. This is a kind of a sphere of a discourse. Maybe that would be some addition to your understanding of the region of memory, and the way you describe the martyrs and Hussein and the repetition of his name and the fact that modern martyrs are martyrs only by, I would call it, through the martyrdom of Hussein. Well, it reminds me the anthropological theories connected with ritual. So to some extent, maybe it's ritualization, and it plays this kind of role. So this repetition of the martyrdom with some recreation is needed for maintaining the certain community that simply has this kind of ritual. It can be, for example, the Shia community that needed for maintaining the not only the identity but also the normal functioning of this community. As I am run out of time, I will pass the microphone back to the chairman. I hope that my remarks would be inspiring both for actors and authors and the audience. Obviously, my remarks are open-ended and more questions than critique. I found that both of the papers really interesting and worth discussion. That's why I made that amount of remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcin. Do you want to respond to Marcin's decision?
Please go ahead, because I think most of the questions was yours. Sorry. You're better than
So, in regards to regions of memory, this is something that I'm still thinking about as well, and I was sort of hoping that throughout the conference that some sort of answer would become more clear. But some of my initial thoughts would be that regions of memory don't necessarily need to be geographical, but they can at the same time, because memory is located at the same time. And memory in each geographical location is going to be slightly different and have its own nuances. So what I was thinking, actually before my paper, was that perhaps the idea of a region is somewhat palimpsestuous. So, as was discussed yesterday, there are so many different layers to memory. And I think that this idea can also be applied to the idea of a region. Because a region can be geographical in the sense that, for my project, migration is taking place within the global south. But also in terms of memory, as if we take the idea of a region to consider how those different colonial spaces are joined because of their colonial pasts. And I think that that's possibly an interesting way of looking at a region, because if we look at the ideas around migration, and although it is somewhat outdated, the idea of push and pull factors for migration, I think that kind of makes a neat parallel to the idea of a region. Now, in terms of everyday life, that's actually a really interesting question, and that's something that I'm actually hoping to devote an entire chapter to on my thesis. Now, this draws mostly on Amanda Wise and her work on everyday multiculturalism. Now, throughout interviews, most participants actually located their memories in their everyday life, and they discuss the differences and similarities to their lives in South Africa and their lives in Australia. The most frequently cited memory was the differences in their lives at home. Now, almost every South African that I've interviewed, and that's 47, they've all commented that back in South Africa, they had domestic servants. Now, they locate their memories of race in part around discussing their domestic servant and their gardeners. For them, this was normal, and it was a naturalized part of their life. They grew up with it. Their children grew up with it. Their children were most often looked after by their domestic servant while their parents were at work. So the domestic servant would become part of the family. But then once they'd moved to Australia, they found it a little bit disconcerting because this was completely different. There were lots of jokes made about, oh, you know, I wish I still had my maid here. This would make my life so much easier when I came home from work. I wouldn't have to, you know, run after the kids and then while I'm still trying to do all the housework and comments like that. Another really interesting comment that was made by one family in particular was on a very racialized comment. This was about the difference in the sorts of jobs that were considered to be acceptable for people to have in South Africa and the difference in Australia. So one morning as I drove out to one family's house for an interview, there was roadworks on the side of the road. And I commented on that when I got there. And I said, oh, you know, hey, how long has the roadwork been going on for? And their comment was, yeah, it's been going on for a while. You know, every time we drive past, we still think it's really weird. I'm like, oh, really? Why is that? Now, the answer I got was, it's weird because the people who are doing traffic control are white. They shouldn't be white. Back in South Africa, they'd be black. So the differences in everyday life and the more uniform white lifestyle that they're experiencing in Australia is completely different to the experience they were having in South Africa. I hope that mostly answers your question about, yeah. Now, in terms of social and cultural capital, for my project at least, this is a very useful way to talk about the differences and the similarities because there's so much overlap between South Africa and Australia. One of the other types of capital that I would comment that is actually very important comes from Ghassan Haj in his book White Nations, Fantasies of White Supremacy in a Multicultural Society, published in 1989. Now, no, sorry, 1998. Now, although this is somewhat outdated and a lot of his ideas have been argued against a lot, I still find the idea of, well, his idea of a field of whiteness to be really interesting. It operates in the same sort of way as all of Bourdieu's fields do, but in this case it focuses specifically on whiteness and a person's ability to accrue white capital to find belonging in Australia. Now, this is also, I guess, somewhat applicable to the idea of memory and its ownership. Now, if the...
Brady, can you repeat this part?
Sure. Now, in terms of like ownership for memory, I think that in a very short way of answering it, that it would be quite confusing for some people to be able to take on some memories of others. I guess in a very provocative way, I'd suggest maybe as a comparison, what about victims of war? Would the victims take on the memories of the perpetrators, and would that be acceptable? Just as a sort of way of thinking about that.
Okay. Younes.
So, you see, I have a very partisan approach to most concepts and most theories. So, when it comes to regions of memory, basically, at the end of a story, we need to apply for jobs, we need to apply for fundings, we need to apply for conferences. So you look how people talk about regions of memory, according to that you can adjust your work. So we have to understand there is a pragmatism in what regions of memory means. And I have a partisan approach because I understand what I mean by it, and also I understand how to have adjusted to this situation. And I don't come from colonial traditions, so I don't write for the theories or ideas for the world. I write anthropological cases for specific cases. So that's why if I say echoes of memory, and yes, it repeats certain signals, it repeats certain parts of the sound, and that's why there's a politics of memory in it. That's why there's a certain guy who censors, who molds the language. There is an Orwellian regime entirely dictates what to be said, because the people who, for example, the memoir which is published, it's a certain form of oral history. It's been collected by literates and the commission authors by the regime to write it down, and again it goes to a censorship board and then it's circulated. And then after that also that circulation is completely in the control of a theocracy and a totalitarian regime. So yes, it echoes certain part of it. That's why I use echoes of memory in this case. And when it comes to memory and memories, yes, I understand there's memory, there's memories, and there's content memory. However, in these cases, actually the content memory is inside of memory. The reason I say look at the memory in itself is because if you look at this, the narrativity and how it has been told, is basically you can see how people have resisted telling their stories in the way the regime wants it. It means how they have played with the words, how they have played with the conjugation of the verbs, and that language has a possibility to slip away from the enforced forms of remembering. So that's why I stick to the idea of memory rather, and if there is something called content memory, in these cases, yes, you may be able to go interview people, slip away from the intelligence services, and make them to tell you there is still content memories. But okay, that's one part of it. But before going such a lengthy way and actually putting your life on a risk in dealing with the regime, so actually when you read the memory, the content memory is inside the memory. That's one of the way I actually deviate from Foucault, which he puts a content memory outside the memory. And ontology, the way I advocate ontology and Deleuzian ontology, it gives you, it's elastic enough, if protein enough, to make ontologies of memory and play with how it's been formed. And my most important question is not what is memory, is what is the rest of what it is. So that's why I say ontic modes, not ontic mode, how it can exist, how it can oscillate between in its limitations. And when it comes to rituals and community and identity, so again, as you have seen my theoretical allegiances, yes, rituals are cool, interesting, but there's very particular social constructions, limitation it has in it, which I don't subscribe to it, because if you start fixating that formations of the social construction, then you lose micro-contingencies, you lose appropriation, you lose subjectivity in limitations of the subject. And that's again when you do identity and community same thing. That's why if you look at throughout my paper, I never say community, I said mnemonic community of individuals. So, yeah, so I do it in a weird way, but sorry, I like weird.
Okay, thank you. And now, immediately I want to open the discussion to the floor. Simon, oh, so many. Okay, so I want to collect the first 3 questions and the response, then a second round of 3 questions. Okay? Simon first. Yeah.
Thank you both for your papers. It was very, very interesting. Thank you, Marcin, as well. 2 questions for Brady, one for Younes. Go in that order. For Brady, inspired by a combination of what Jeff Olek said yesterday about a possible region of memory between the US, Canada, and maybe Australia as places which are united by their colonial histories. First of all, do you have any numbers about of how many South Africans have moved to Australia, as opposed to, say, the USA? In what sense is this South Africa Australia axis a major vector Secondly, in terms of prosthetic memory, it seems to me that there's a bit of a slippage. The quotes you gave, they're a bit vague, aren't they? They don't really say much about this Anzac narrative. I'm not really entirely sure what the Anzac narrative is yet, actually. And this suggests to me that they're not really fully buying into the Anzac narrative with any kind of substance. So my question is, I wonder if, so another little point, they also seem to be living in places with Aboriginal names. I can't remember them, but there is a kind of contradiction, a paradox. So the question is, if there is this overall anti-colonial narrative, or the narrative of a threatened majority, to what extent are they actually rejecting a hegemonic transnational discourse of post-colonialism? We usually associate post-colonialism with the oppressed, the colonized. But maybe here we can talk of a kind of inverse region of memory, where the dominant narrative is kind of reproduces a photographic negative, something like that. Younes, echoes of memory, I think, are very interesting in terms of regions, because echoes, the very idea of an echo implies a finite space, right? You have a mountain over there, you shouted it, and the noise comes back. You didn't talk much about noise coming back and being received by the original enunciator, the person who said it. So I wonder if in Orange County, Pakistan, or other places you talked about, the memory comes back, and whether in a distorted form with a delay, whether we can talk about any kind of region in this sense, if I find out about this space.
Then you answer.
Yeah, just a very short question. Oh, sorry. Short question to Brady. I wonder how the Anzac memory of the people who migrated to Australia, if you call it prosthetic memory, differs from the memory of the Australians who were born after 1915. Isn't it prosthetic memory for almost everyone who did not experience the event? So why to bring migrants into that issue? So there certainly might be some reasons, but it would be nice if you explain.
I have two questions for each author. Brady, in concentrating so much on the context, the similar context of the two continents, you're basically suggesting that someone else could not take on this prosthetic memory. So to put it very provocatively, could an Irish person take on the same memory, yes or no? And one for Younes, if you're saying you're concentrating on the memory itself, I wonder what that would be. I mean, can we talk about, is there something like a memory? What about the context? You're saying yourself it's transformed constantly. So if you take this out, if you take the people out, how can you get to this one memory? And then if so, what would be the difference between memory and history?
Okay. No, the next round. Okay. Can you respond? Yep. Okay. Can I collect one more question?
Yes, please.
Yes, please. Then.
You're the chair.
So thanks, guys, for this interesting presentations. I've got a question to Younes, actually, because as far as already more than 20 years passed since the war is over, yeah? So the new generation was born, a generation which was not facing what was going on. So when you were talking about the echoes of memory, I just have this very controversial and fashionable in some way term of post-memory in mind. So I just wanted to ask you whether you see some differences between the perception of the past, the memory, the new memory of those guys who don't have a memory, in compared to those who are facing the war or who are living in the time of war. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Can you respond?
So let me start from the end. So it seems actually the echoes of memory has provoked some echoes actually. So just to put this idea of echo to the rest. First, you see, echo memory is a certain metaphor. And the metaphor, actually, I use it because it leaves a little ambiguity to research, to stutter, to actually research limp a little. I don't want a perfect research, because if I do a perfect job, I believe perfection from my side. So I leave it slightly ambiguous, and the way Foucault says basically my work is a toolbox. You rummage in it and you find what is necessary for your work. So I give you enough space, I give my reader enough space to find how it is relevant and how you can stretch it further, rather than to fix it in a certain definition and certain category. But yes, when it's a matter of coming back, actually the regime particular guarantees on its system to echo comes back, and that's basically subsidized pilgrimage and subsidized travels, and also, for example, they have found actually professors. Want to give a prime example, Professor Paul Strockman. So basically, he's from Vrije University. He's been particularly paid and commissioned to translate these books to English. And the publisher who is publishing in the United States is a proxy of Iran who is publishing it. So it's not a major publication. And the book, for example, recently was published. It's been printed 130 times in a span of 6 months. There's such a large consumption of these memories. So it guarantees the comeback. It guarantees if this, let's say, source of echo, it's so-called Shia, Iranian version of Shiism, it guarantees its comeback. It's basically strategized to bring it back if it even doesn't want to come back. So that's matter of echo. And it's a matter of the post-memories and the new memories, so, and which actually answers the idea of history versus memory. If you today go in Iran, look at anywhere, try to find a book which is called History of Iran-Iraq War. It's almost near impossible. There is one book, and that's basically a chronological account of the documents which are printed, and it's called History. The regime has guaranteed from the time basically the war started, this is the regime of memory. Basically, people from the frontiers would come back to their mosque and talk about the memories of the frontier, how actually the war was happening. So there was not much of a past, the war was happening, and they were telling the memories and the basically khataras, because they wanted to attract more volunteers and send them to the frontiers, because the Iranian war basically was fought by volunteers rather than the official established army. So, and the memories from that time also become documented, and they're documented under a certain control regime. So there is not much of a difference. There is a slightly what is so-called selective memory, because nowadays after more than 20 years, actually around 30 years after war, so some people who they refuse to tell their memories because they said, I did my deal with God and I don't need to propagate and tell what I did or my bravery to others. So they kept it private, but now they start remembering, and they're basically commissioning authors are collecting those memories. But there's a preface, in the preface they say, okay, we are seeing the threat, there's a threat again for our revolution, because during the time of Ahmadinejad there were certain problems and there's the factions in the regime, so they felt that revolution is under threat. So they're remembering for the sake of revolution to basically say, okay, we have done so much sacrifice, no, we cannot basically betray the regime, we cannot reform, we cannot do anything. So people, and interestingly when I look at the names, there's a renouncing certain people who are understood as an anti-regime after 30 years, but meanwhile during the war, they were the generals of the war. They were people who were titled with the honorary titles, so to people who actually were leading the fight. But these people are renounced today, and their names have become lesser mentioned in the memories. That much, there is a post-memory or selective memory. So when it comes to idea of the exactly what it is and how I say what memory in itself, so when you look at the memory minus people, it's a certain narrative given to you. And a narrative, in narratology, there's a specific method. Particularly, I follow Mika Ball in the way of accessing narrative. You can break it, it's the way it's been told, the way the narrative emerges. And I believe everything can be object in its own right. You access it, you feel it somehow, and even when the narrative becomes a book, the book has a tactile existence. The book cover affects you. It has an affective quality. That is nothing to do with the guy who is the author of it. No, because author, as to quote Martyrs, author is already dead. So it has a quality in itself. And how do I do it? As I explained, for example, I look at the sign and the whole sign emerges. And for example, a book designer breaks the paragraph in 2 different pages to affect you in a certain way. How the book cover tries to resemble certain things, certain changes. And this is memory by itself, minus people. So that's how I see it. And how is it different from history? People call it different, not me. I'm an anthropologist. They don't call it history of war. They call it memory. So that's why, and as an anthropologist, I take what they say. If during the day they say it's night, I believe it. I don't contest it. I may expose my doubts. They say, oh, by the way, it was the day, but people call it night. But who am I to, like a colonial master, contest the fact, okay, your tradition sounds weird. Yeah, so I have a limitation on the bar of the weirdness, actually.
Okay, thank you. Ready?
Okay, just to get through these questions quickly. Now, in terms of the number of South African migrants, since the last census in Australia, which was 2011, there were close to 150,000 South Africans living in Australia. And since then, I'll just go with the Department of Immigration because the rest of that name changes every other day. There have been 7,000 to 9,000 additional entrants each year since then. Then as for numbers for other places like Canada, United States, I haven't actually found those yet, but that is still coming. It just depends whether or not I can fit a discussion like that in my actual thesis. In terms of the slippage you noticed, within the idea of prosthetic memory, and I would actually argue that it's not post-colonial, rather it's still colonial, simply because there hasn't been any complete reconciliation with the past. It's still essentially an open wound that Australia needs to come to terms with. So it's, and I believe Deborah Bird-Rose also comments that in one of her papers. I think that's from memory. Now, in terms of Australians taking on Anzac memories as a prosthetic memory. Yes, they do, but at the same time it's slightly different from South Africans because most Australians would actually have family connections to those who fought in either World War I, World War II, and all the other wars that Australia has been part of that Anzac Day commemorates. Now, South Africans as a group, and whether or not you could substitute the group for the Irish, for example, you could. There's no doubt about it. But South Africans are actually, I think, as South Africans at least, are more interesting because of their status as a colony. They were, as part of the Global South, or as a colony in the Global South, because they're both countries that meant that there was an erasure of Aboriginal culture that came with the colonisation by the British, and there was also a very stark discussion between colour and such a strong colour line between white and black, and the subjugation of those groups within that colonial context, I think makes it more interesting, just because I find race to be a very interesting topic to discuss, so yeah. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, the time is running out now, but is there anyone who is really desperate to raise a question, and then I can take just one more question? Okay, Anne.
Asian immigration to Australia. I'd be very curious to know if they have shown the similar type of participation in Anzac Day, which I could imagine being plausible just because it's about being Australian. and celebrating. But on the other hand, you could also think there's certain paths which are not, certain bridges which are, cannot be crossed, that there's no electric affinities. And so I'd be very curious to hear, because the Irish one is a different, I think, a different case, but the Chinese is coming from a very different place.
Yeah,
So-
sure. So that's actually quite different again. Even though they are part of the same region, there's actually been a long-standing fear of Asian migration to Australia, particularly in Queensland. And those differences in race tend to, well, for individuals, tend to make it a lot more difficult for those who are visibly different to participate effectively, I guess, in those sorts of events, because it is a lot harder for them to buy into those sorts of events because they are being seen as being completely different, not only linguistically, but also culturally. It's actually, again, something that Ghassan Haj has written a lot about in Paranoid Nationalism, I think it's called.
Thank you.